Giovanni, you ended our last conversation with an image that has been haunting my sleep all week. You said the sky over Rome turned the color of blood. Honestly, looking at the Roman Forum today, it is so peaceful. It is hard to imagine it choked with smoke and screaming.
Well, that is the beauty and the trap of Rome, Sarah. It hides its scars under layers of marble and sunlight. But what our ancient sources call 390 BC, though many modern historians note a discrepancy in Greek chronology that points to 387 or 386 BC, became, in Roman memory, the year the sun effectively went out. Whether you take the exact date or the legend, it was a trauma they never forgot.
You called it a theological apocalypse. That feels a bit dramatic, even for you. Usually, you are the one telling me to look at the drainage systems and the brickwork. Why was this specifically a theological disaster?
Because to a Roman, a lost battle is just a bad day at the office. But the Gallic sack of Rome? That was evidence that the gods had literally packed their bags and moved out.
Like a divine eviction notice?
Exactly. And we are standing right next to the perfect place to feel that tension. Look down here at the Lapis Niger, the Black Stone. It's actually one of the key stops in our Roman Forum tour in the app. If you open the map there, you'll see we're standing exactly where the history of the Republic was written in rock.
I see it. It is that area of black marble paving, right? It looks like a caution sign. It is roped off even now.
In Roman memory, this spot was marked as sacred over 2,500 years ago. Traditional sources, though written centuries later, claimed it was the grave of Romulus, while others believed it was a place where a profound transgression had occurred. It was considered religiosus, a site of prodigies or bad omens that demanded caution. And when a prodigy occurred, say a lamb born with two heads or lightning striking a temple, they didn't shrug. They recorded it in the Annales Maximi, the official, great annals. A special board of priests, Theduoviri, would investigate what god is angry, what ritual was skipped. It was like a divine audit.
So the speaking voice wasn't just ignored, it was unfiled. They didn't even open the case. If the black stone is the bad omen, then that fateful year is the omen coming true.
Precisely. You see, Sarah, the Romans lived by a concept called ad religio. We translate it as religion, but it really means to bind. It was a legal contract. You give the gods a pig, the gods give you a victory. It was predictable. It was safe.
It sounds very transactional, almost like a cosmic vending machine.
In a way, yes. But that summer, the machine didn't just break. It started spitting out fire. The Senones tribe of Gauls, who had already settled along the Adriatic coast east of the Apennine Mountains, moved westward across the mountains toward Rome like a force of nature. Though we call them Gauls, they weren't a single nation, more like a constellation of tribes, each with its own king and customs. The Senones were one of the newest arrivals in Italy, having crossed the Alps only a generation earlier. They settled along the coast, modern Marche, building hill forts, farming, and trading with the Etruscans. To them, Rome was the upstart.
So this wasn't an invasion from the edge of the world. It was a border dispute that went very wrong.
And to the Roman mind, it wasn't random. If the vending machine broke, it was because someone had used the wrong coin. They had failed in the ritual, missed a prayer, misread a sign, ignored a voice. The gods were precise accountants.
And for a city that prided itself on its sacred contract, that must have felt like the gods were suing them for breach of contract.
That is a very modern way to put it, but it is accurate. In the Roman telling, they didn't ask, why are the Gauls so strong? They asked, how did we offend the heavens? They looked for the ritual error, the stutter in a prayer, the ignored sign. You know, standing here by the Black Stone, I realize we are only scratching the surface of how deep this trauma went into the actual soil.
Wait, if we're only scratching the surface, how does a visitor see it all without getting overwhelmed? There's so much text on these monuments.
That's why I love the filtering in the companion app. If you're in a hurry, you set it to highlights. But if you want the deep dive we're doing today, you can filter for history or importance and get all 40 paragraphs for a single spot. It lets you control the depth. Ancient writers describe walls, ash, and rebuilding. Archaeologists find complex layers under the forum, but how much matches the old narratives is debated, so the soil keeps both story and mystery. Now here's where the story and the ground beneath our feet don't quite line up.
But wait, if it was as catastrophic as the story says, where's the evidence? Shouldn't there be, like a city-wide ash layer, the smoking crater of Roman trauma?
You'd think so, but rebuilding erases evidence. Roman builders didn't sift layers. They leveled, filled, and paved over. What archaeologists do find in early 4th century layers are shattered pottery, weapon fragments, and sudden shifts in house orientation. Not a clean burn line, but the quiet signature of rupture. And it wasn't just memory. Rome encoded the wound into its calendar. The Dies Aliensis, traditionally remembered as July 18th, was Marked Nefastus, a day when no public business could be conducted. Generals avoided battle. Senates adjourned. For centuries, that date carried a chill. Never again on this day.
So the Alia wasn't just a place. It became a time, a recurring alarm on Rome's internal clock. That is incredible. If you want to really see those layers and understand how the city was literally rebuilt on top of this disaster, our companion app, Rome Audio Tour Guide offline app, is a lifesaver. We have only just touched on the history here, but the app breaks this single spot down into detailed audio segments. It lets you see the maps of where the fire spread while you are standing right in the middle of it.
It absolutely does. Having that spatial layout is key for understanding, because the fire was the end of the story. The beginning was much quieter. It was a voice.
Okay, you mentioned the speaking voice before. It sounds like a ghost story.
For the Romans, it was a terrifying part of their tradition. According to the legend, a plebeian called Marcus Caedicius heard a voice, Ius Locutius, the speaking voice, and warned the authorities. According to later Roman tradition, he was ignored, and only afterward, an altar was dedicated to that voice. It's part of how Romans explain the disaster.
Probably just trying to get home after a long day of, I don't know, making pottery or whatever plebeians did back then.
Well, the story goes, it was a quiet night. Suddenly he heard a voice. It wasn't a whisper. It was a command. It told him a simple, chilling truth. The Gauls are coming. Just imagine it. A cold morning months before the attack. Dust in the air. The smell of baking bread from a neighbor's oven. Children chasing a stray dog past the household lararium. That little shrine by the doorway where every family made its daily offering to the lares, the guardians of the home. Life was rhythm, not prophecy.
So when Caedicius hears that voice, he's not just interrupting politics, he's breaking the rhythm. So he did the right thing, right? He went to the authorities?
He did. He went to the tribunes. He went to the magistrates and senate. He told them the gods had spoken to him. And do you know what the elite, sophisticated Roman senators did?
I am going to guess they laughed at him.
They did more than laugh. But it wasn't just a matter of protocol, Sarah. According to the historian Livy, the magistrates dismissed him primarily because of his humble station. To the aristocratic senators, it was unthinkable that the gods would bypass the official augurs and high-ranking priests to whisper a state secret to a commoner. Besides, at that moment, the Gauls were still a distant, almost mythical threat. They didn't just ignore a voice. They ignored a man they didn't think was worth their time, dismissing a divine warning as nothing more than a peasant's superstition. Let's pause here for a moment. Titus Livius, born just before the birth of Christ, wrote a massive history of Rome. 142 books. Only about a quarter survive.
So most of Rome's origin story is missing?
Exactly. What does survive wasn't written as a war report. Livy wrote under Augustus at the dawn of the empire, trying to explain how Rome became great and why it nearly wasn't.
So he's not a journalist. He's more like a philosopher with a timeline.
Exactly. He believed Rome's moral fiber had frayed, and this early disaster for him was a warning flare from the past. This is what happens when you stop listening to the gods, or to each other.
So the speaking voice isn't just a spooky story. It's Livy's way of saying, pay attention, or history will repeat.
And that is the scalability trap, isn't it? A system so invested in hierarchy that it filters out truth by social class. Livy didn't invent that tension. He diagnosed it.
Yes, that goes back to the scalability trap from our last episode. The Roman system was becoming so rigid that it couldn't even hear a warning if it didn't come in a fancy toga.
Exactly. By ignoring the warning, according to the legend, they committed the ultimate unbinding. They broke their religio, they broke the bond with the gods. They essentially told the gods that their warnings were not welcome.
It is like hanging up on a divine emergency call.
That is a perfect analogy. Later, when the city was a pile of ash, they felt so guilty about this that they built an altar to Gaius Locutus, the speaking voice. It was an altar to the god they had ignored. But in that moment, by ignoring the voice, they had committed a kind of ritual pollution, nephas. They had broken the pax deorum, the peace with the gods. And once that peace was broken, every action that followed was spiritually unclean. Think of nephas like radiation. Once you're contaminated, you can't just scrub your hands and go back to work.
So ritual error wasn't a misstep, it was contamination.
Everything you touch becomes unclean. That's why, later in 216 BCE, after the disaster at Cannae, the Senate didn't just raise a new army. They consulted the Sibylline books, buried 2 Greeks alive in the Forum, and sent envoys to Delphi. Only then did they fight again. You don't act until the field is decontaminated.
So when the survivors ran past the gates open, they weren't panicking. They were evacuating a toxic zone. It is a bit late for an apology at that point, isn't it? Sorry we didn't listen to the voice. Please ignore the fact that our city is currently on fire.
It was their way of trying to rebind the contract. But in the moment, that arrogance, that belief that they knew better than the signs, is what led them straight to the river Alia.
And that is where the blood-red sky stops being a metaphor and starts being a reality.
Yes, because the Gauls weren't just coming to talk, they were coming to erase Rome from the map.
So we have the ignored warning and the broken contract. Now the army is actually at the door. I want to know about the soldiers. Were they as arrogant as the senators?
They were worse, Sarah. They were unprepared. They marched out to meet the Gauls at the Alia with no plan and no ritual protection. They were walking into a black day without even realizing it. No auspices taken. No chickens fed. And that mattered. In Roman logic, if the omens are bad, say, the sacred chickens refuse to eat, you don't just go anyway. You stop. To ignore the gods was to invite the very disaster the Romans were about to face at the Alia.
So the soldiers at the Alia weren't just unprepared. They were unauthorized. Spiritually speaking, they had already lost. I feel like Black Day is going to be a recurring theme here.
Oh, it became the definition of the Roman calendar. But before we get to the battle itself, we need to talk about what it felt like to be inside the city walls when that first group of survivors came running back.
Without their shields, I assume?
Without their shields, without their dignity, and without any hope. The silence in the Forum must have been deafening.
Let's get into the chaos of that retreat. Because if the speaking voice was the warning, the Battle of the Alia was the crash.
It was more than a crash. It was a slaughter.
It's a long walk to visualize that from here. I am going to put my phone away and just listen while we move.
Perfect. The Rome Audio Tour Guide offline app is built for that. The Smart Play keeps the story going even with your screen off. And since we downloaded the tour earlier, we won't lose the audio even if the signal drops between these massive stone ruins.
Okay, Giovanni? We've traveled 11 miles north of the city to the Alia River. I am trying to visualize this. It is a hot July day, July 18th. While historians today argue whether the year was 390 or 387 BC, the Romans were certain about the day. The 18th became the most cursed date on their calendar. You've got the Romans, a citizen militia of that era, standing there. Their exact gear is lost to time, but we imagine a mix of bronze and leather, sweating, looking across the water, and then there are the Gauls.
And the Gauls are not standing still. They are a wall of noise. They are shouting, clashing their spears against their shields, and blowing those Carnacs' horns. The sound alone was meant to strip away your humanity, to make you feel like a small, frightened animal. And that noise wasn't just theater. These were warriors trained from boyhood to project terror, not because they were irrational, but because in their world, battle was a legal procedure. If you could break your enemy's spirit before the first blow, you avoided unnecessary bloodshed. That's why the Carnacs wasn't just a horn. It was diplomacy by other means.
And it worked, didn't it? You said the Roman lines didn't just break. They evaporated? I mean, did they even throw a single spear?
Very few. The left wing of the Roman army was pushed into the river almost immediately. Imagine the panic. You have these heavy bronze breastplates on, you are being shoved backward into a rushing current, and behind you the barbarians are screaming. Many Romans drowned before a Gallic sword even touched them. Those who could swim scrambled across to the other side and fled to the ruins of Veii, the city they had conquered a few years earlier.
They abandoned their own city? That is like the ultimate betrayal of the Roman virtue we keep hearing about.
It was a total breakdown of the system. In the Roman telling, because the rituals were skipped and the speaking voice was ignored, the gods had withdrawn their presence. Without the gods, the soldiers were said to feel they were already dead men walking. In their view, they weren't just running from Gauls. They were running from the anger of the gods. Why fight for a city that the heavens had already vacated?
So the road to Rome is just open? No gates locked? No guards on the walls?
It was an open wound. The few survivors who did make it back to Rome didn't even bother to shut the gates. They believed the end of the world had arrived. They just kept running, straight up to the top of the Capitoline Hill and started huddling there like castaways on an island. Let's pause here, Sarah. Not on the hill, but before it. Picture the first men stumbling through the Porticalina, bronze helmets dented, cuirasses cracked, sandals split by river stones. Their shields, scuda they'd sworn to die with, are gone. Their hands are empty. And the silence, it's not peaceful. It's the silence of a city holding its breath. No clatter from the Via Sacra. No smoke from household hearths. Just the smell of dust, and something sharper beneath it. Fear sweat, old blood, the tang of the river.
So the first thing Rome sees after its army breaks is empty hands.
Think of what that silence meant, not just in the forum, but in the alleyways. No horns. No magistrates shouting orders. Just mothers pulling their children inside, checking the locks on doors that had never needed them. In a world where your safety depended on your patronus, your patron, what do you do when even he has fled to the hill?
So the social contract, human contract, broke first. Before the gods left, the people did. This is such a different image of Rome than the one we have of the legions or the empire. It is a city in a state of absolute, pathetic collapse.
It is the year zero of Roman identity. Everything that comes after this, the walls, the discipline, the obsession with ritual, it all stems from the shame of this day. The day they realized that if you ignore the speaking voice, you end up drowning in the Alia.
And while the soldiers are huddling on the hill, the Gauls are approaching. I want to know about the people who stayed behind in the forum. Because if the army ran away, someone had to face the music.
That's why, in the decades and centuries following the sack, they constructed the massive stone agger Servi Tulli, 11 kilometers of tufa blocks, 4 meters thick, 10 meters high. Not elegant, not fast, butene-scapable. You can still walk its fragments near Termini Station. Rough, massive, stubborn. This wasn't just defense. It was a vow in stone. Never open the gates again.
So the walls weren't just around the city. They were around the memory. That sounds like a bridge we need to cross. Let's move from the river back into the heart of the city, where the smoke is starting to rise.
It is a walk from fear to faith, Sarah.
This brings us back to the Roman Forum. The army is huddling on the Capitoline Hill, the gates are open, and the Gauls are tentatively entering the city. I say tentatively because they actually thought it was a trap, right?
They did. And it wasn't paranoia. The Gauls. Anger was fresh. Just a year earlier, a Roman envoy named Quintus Fabius violated the law of nations by killing a Gallic chieftain during a skirmish. When Rome refused to hand the Fabii over for trial, the Gauls saw it as a total breach of sacred law. To them, Rome's oaths were traps.
So when the Romans fled the Forum, the Gauls didn't see cowards. They saw oath breakers.
They expected a city like Rome to fight to the last man. When they marched through the city gates and found the streets empty and the houses silent, they were terrified. They thought the Romans were hiding in the shadows, waiting to pounce. So they step in. Torchlight flickers on vacant doorways. No shutters closed, no bolts drawn. Inside one house, a half-burnt offering of spelt cakes on the lararium cold. In another, a dropped spindle, wool still tangled in its whorl. The city isn't empty. It's abandoned mid-ritual. To the Gauls, whose own homes center on the sacred hearth, whose oaths are sworn over fire, this wasn't just eerie. It was unnatural, as if the world had skipped a beat.
So the silence wasn't just absence. It was sacrilege. But the Romans weren't in the shadows. They were right out in the open.
This is the most haunting image in the whole story, Sarah. According to the tradition, the elderly senators, the former consuls, the men who had spent their lives building the Republic, they didn't hide. They dressed in their most sacred robes, the ones they wore for triumphs and high festivals. They took their curule chairs, their ivory seats of office, and they placed them in the entryways of their homes or in the middle of the forum.
And they just sat there, like they were waiting for a bus?
They sat like statues. They were performing the Devotio. And this was a formal ritual. The ancient sources record that the elderly priests and magistrates, including Marcus Folius the Pontifex Maximus, prepared themselves with sacred rituals before sitting in their ceremonial robes, creating what resembled the solemn Devotio sacrifice. They weren't just sitting there. They had legally handed their lives over to the gods of the underworld to curse the Gauls.
Okay, you've used that word before. Explain it to me like I am a very confused Gaul. What is a devotio?
It is a radical, terrifying ritual. A leader would devote himself and the lives of the enemy to the gods of the underworld. By sitting there, motionless, they were essentially saying, I am already dead. I am a sacrifice. And by taking my life, the gods will be legally obligated to take yours too.
So they were weaponizing their own deaths. It wasn't surrender, it was a curse.
Precisely. It was the ultimate sacred contract. If the soldiers couldn't save Rome with iron, the old men would save it with blood. They were binding the Gauls to a debt that could only be paid in destruction. In Roman ritual, once a devotio was sworn, it was irreversible. The man was already dead in the eyes of the gods. His life was a burnt offering. That's why they sat so still. They were already ghosts, waiting for the Gauls to collect.
Wait, so was this really how it happened? Rows of senators in chairs, waiting to be cursed? Or is this Livy being Livy?
A vital question. Earlier historians, like Polybius, who wrote 200 years before Livy and actually visited Rome, were far more pragmatic. Had likely called this magnificent theater, and later skeptics, like Cicero, knew some of these tales were fabulae, stories shaped more for moral instruction than forensic accuracy. And that's key. The word barbarous, barbarian, meant non-Latin speaker. To a Roman, the Gauls didn't just look frightening. They sounded like chaos. Their guttural speech, their lack of written laws, it confirmed what Rome needed to believe, that their own order was civilization itself.
So the horror wasn't just the sack, it was hearing your own language fail. The moment the Pax Deorum broke, the world went barbaric. Literally.
That's it, Sarah. Barbarous wasn't just a word for foreigner. It was the sound of order collapsing. And that's exactly why the story had to be told this way. Here's the Roman genius. They didn't care if every detail was provable. If a story taught you how to be Roman, brave, pious, unyielding, then it was true in the way that mattered most. For them, history wasn't just what happened. It was what had to have happened. The geese had to cackle. The voice had to be ignored. The old men had to sit in silence. Otherwise, the lesson collapses. And imagine being a young boy, say the grandson of one of those senators, watching from a doorway as his grandfather, in full regalia, sits down in the dust and doesn't move. Not for water. Not for his family. Not even when his own grandson cries his name. In that moment, pietas, duty to family, collides with pietas, duty to Rome. Which one wins?
Greater than... No wonder they needed the geese to cackle later. You'd need something to break that silence. I am picturing these Gauls, who are used to screaming and fighting, walking into the forum and seeing these rows of silent, white-bearded men in ivory chairs. They must have looked like gods.
That is exactly what the ancient historians say. The Gauls were mesmerized. They didn't know whether to bow or to kill. One Gaul, bolder than the rest, walked up to an elderly senator.
Oh, I remember this. He touched the beard, didn't he?
He reached out and stroked the elderly senator's long, white beard. Perhaps he was checking to see if it was real or if he was just a statue, and the senator, without a word, brought his ivory staff down on the Gaul's head.
That is so incredibly old man energy. Don't touch the merchandise, kid.
It was the spark that blew up the powder keg. The Gaul drew his sword and killed the senator where he sat. And then the massacre began. The senators were slaughtered in their chairs. The houses were looted. The fire was set.
So the Devotio was complete. The sacrifice was made. But the city was still burning.
The traditional story says the city below was a funeral pyre. Sarah. Even if the physical evidence for a citywide burn is missing, for the Romans living through it, it was an apocalypse. But look up. The Capitoline Hill was the only place left standing. On that hill, the Romans were about to discover that while the gods might accept a sacrifice, they also expect you to pay attention to the geese.
The geese. I knew we were getting to the birds eventually. But before we get to the sacred geese, I want to talk about that fire. Was it total? Did anything survive?
The ancient writers say the city was a funeral pyre, Sarah. But interestingly, modern archaeologists haven't found a citywide burn layer from this time. It's likely the fire was localized to wooden houses, and the blank slate was a bit of dramatic license by later Roman historians to emphasize the city's rebirth.
A blank slate that was about to be defended by the most unlikely alarm system in history.
Indeed, the defense of the capital was about to become a matter of feathers and fate.
So how do we get from a city in flames to geese saving the Republic?
According to the legend, it's the middle of the night. The Gauls have been occupying the ruins for months. They find a secret path up the side of the hill. They pass the Roman guard dogs, who were half-starved and didn't make a sound. They reach the top of the wall. Now, freeze. They're at the crest. Below, the sleeping camp. Above, the dark silhouette of the capital shrine, the Aedes Iovis. The night is windless. No dogs bark. No sentry calls. Just the scrape of a sword hilt on tufa, the rustle of a leather tunic. One man kneels to test the ground, a ritual gesture. asking the earth for favor. His hand brushes something soft. Feathers. White, downy, scattered near a low stone pen. And then...
And the geese were there. Why were there geese on a military citadel during a famine? I would have been looking for the orange sauce.
That is the legendary key. As the story goes, the Romans were starving, but they refused to eat the geese because they were sacred to the goddess Juno. It's a powerful image. Even in their darkest hour, they supposedly kept the sacred contract, honoring the goddess property above their own hunger.
So basically, Rome's security system was sacred poultry? Great.
And Livy loves that irony. Because yes, it's absurd. But that's the point. The gods don't send chariots or lightning. They send geese. Humble, noisy, inconvenient truth. Just like the voice of a potter no one wanted to hear. It's a great image, and the Romans never stopped telling it. The story goes that as the first Gaul climbed over, the geese began to cackle and flap. The noise woke up a man named Marcus Manlius. He grabbed his shield, ran to the wall, and knocked the first Gaul back down the cliff.
It is amazing. The dogs failed. The humans were asleep, but the sacred birds did the job. Does this mean the Romans thought Juno herself had sounded the alarm?
They were convinced of it. To them, the geese of the capital were the divine voice returning to the city. The speaking voice they had ignored earlier was now screaming at them through the geese. It was the moment the contract was renewed.
It is a beautiful way to close that loop. But even with the hills saved, they are still surrounded.
And that fear never fully left. When Caesar invaded Gaul centuries later, he didn't just seek glory. He sought exorcism. His commentaries are filled with obsessive detail about Gallic tactics, weapons, even their hair. Why? Because to defeat the ghost, you had to understand the man.
So the geese didn't just save the capital. They shaped an empire. How does this actually end?
The famous story says Rome paid a heavy ransom, and the Gallic leader Brennus tossed his sword on the scale with the cry, victis, woe to the conquered. Later storytellers add a last-minute Camillus who saves the city, but modern historians treat that rescue as part of Rome's heroic memory, rather than a verified fact.
It's a powerful lesson on how a disaster becomes a foundation story. The trauma didn't break Rome. It made them obsessed with never being the conquered again.
And that obsession was religious at its core. Religio, the binding contract. Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. Devotio, the ultimate sacrifice. These weren't just ideas. They were the operating system of Rome's soul, tested in fire and sealed in goose feathers. And that's the paradox. What looks like weakness to us, the terror, the flight, the silence, was, to them, fidelity. To feel the weight of Nephis was to take the contract seriously. Panic wasn't failure. It was proof they still believed in the system, even as it broke. It turned their religion into a shield. They would spend the next few centuries making sure they were the ones holding the weights on the scale. And that shield was built on a simple, terrifying lesson. Ignore the signs, and the gods will ignore you. But keep the rituals pure, even if it means starving while sacred geese cackle. And the gods might just save you. And that lesson, the trauma of being inside while the world broke in, never left them. Later, when they built the Aurelian walls, 4 centuries after the empire was secure, they weren't fearing a new enemy. They were exorcising an old ghost. The obsession with auguries, with ritual exactness, even down to the direction of bird flu, wasn't just superstition. It was the bedrock of the Roman state, a system that long predated the sack. But after 390 BC, the memory of that disaster lent a desperate, tangible urgency to every ritual. It felt less like tradition and more like essential maintenance, checking the locks on the universe. One misstep back then, and the city fell. So in 100 BC, they checked twice. And that fury when a client kingdom broke a treaty? That wasn't just politics. It was the boy who watched his grandfather sit in silence while a stranger touched his beard, grown up, armored, and determined that no one would ever laugh at Rome again.
So the Republic wasn't built on victory.
It was built on the vow never to feel that small again.
If this story of the geese and the gold has inspired your next trip to the Capitoline, download Rome Audio Tour Guide offline app. The offline app will let you stand here, headphones on, and hear the ghosts without burning your data. Walk the spots, press play, and let the city do the rest. You can even preview the tours at RomeUnveiled.com before you fly.
Until next time, Sarah.
Arrivederci.